I'm Tom Woodward, and I teach at Trinity College of Florida, and I'm your host for the Princeton Chronicles, which contain the highlights of a delightful conversation I had recently in Princeton, New Jersey, with 3 professors at the university. These professors are well known in their fields of British history, of chemical engineering, plasma physics, but they have something that bonds them together, that pulls them together, and that is their articulate faith in Jesus Christ. You know, the seal of Princeton University is like a shield, and it contains an open Bible and the words Dei sub numine viget, which is a Latin motto which means under God's power may she flourish. Well, there's something interesting that's flourishing at Princeton University, and that is a Christian faith, a vital, articulate Christian faith among several of the faculty there that you're going to have an opportunity to meet today. Let's travel to Princeton and meet these 3 professors. We're delighted that you 3 gentlemen could join us today. And I'd like to begin with Dr. Eugenio Biagini. Dr. Biagini has been a professor for several years at the Princeton campus, did his graduate work at the University of Pisa in Italy. And Dr. Biagini's specialty is British history. He studied for 7 years and did graduate work at Cambridge University, and is the author of 2 textbooks published by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Biagini, thank you for joining us. Next, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Robert Prudhomme. Dr. Prudhomme is a professor of chemical engineering at Princeton University, and he is a graduate of both Stanford University and the University of Wisconsin, where he received his PhD in chemical engineering and has been on the Princeton faculty since 1978. Editor, I believe, of several books in that area. Dr. Prudhomme, thank you for joining us. And finally, Dr. Bob Kaida. Dr. Kaida received his graduate degree and his PhD from Rutgers University and is the principal research physicist at the Plasma Research Fusion Research Laboratory on the Princeton campus. He received his PhD in the area of nuclear physics and is a graduate, as we said, of Rutgers, where he has published a number of papers in the area of fusion research. Dr. Kaida, thank you for joining us. As we gather here today, and I wanted to thank you again for taking your time out of your busy schedule. We had 2 professors that we spoke with yesterday. They were jetting out of the Princeton area to California, and so I'm glad that we were able to gather the 3 of you together. Let me pose a general question to you as Christian professors here on the Princeton campus. What do you find to be some of the points of contact between yourself and those interested in the Christian faith? In particular, let me pose a situation. Let's say a student came to you, had heard about your faith perspective, your Christian commitment, and they came to you and said, for example, Dr. Prudhomme or Dr. Biagini, what do you see to be some of the reasons that the Christian faith is true? In other words, this person is an interested but skeptical inquirer, and he says to you, for example, about Dr. Kaida, why is Christianity true? What would you say? I don't know who wants to volunteer to take that question.
I could start by saying that this has happened with the graduate students I've worked with from time to time, and I try to put it in a little bit of the context of what we do in our work. We start out with some data, and one way of approaching it is to say that we have the data of humanity. We find that people have values. They have standards to which they would like to live up to, but they don't. If you combine that with a belief in a God, a creator, and a need to reconcile yourself with that creator, then the only way I feel is through the person of Jesus Christ. It is the only faith I know of that provides this venue. And expressed in those terms, many people do find that understandable if they accept the historicity of Christ and the existence of God.
So the moral reality of the sense of right and wrong is the entree, if you will, the contact point between the claim that Christianity is true and the reality that we experience.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Well, is there anything that would come to either of you other gentlemen, Dr. Biagini, Dr. Prudhomme, in regard to this scenario where a student says, why do you believe Christianity is true? Anything that you would add to that?
Well, for myself, in addition to the moral argument, which I think is a very strong one, that there really is a right and wrong embedded in the universe, I'd point to the fact that there is this creation that we are faced with. One of the experiences that happened to me in college as an undergraduate was in my sophomore year physics course. the professor is Professor Sands, who was the associate director of the Stanford Linear Accelerator, came into the physics class one day and said, we now know the universe began, X billion years ago, and there was this thing called the Big Bang that happened back then. That was, as a fairly young Christian at that time, that was a revelation for me, because all through high school I had been sort of taught that the physical universe had always been, that was the standard picture back then. And here was a world-class scientist telling me that no, there was a time equals zero when the universe that we know came into being. And that certainly is a very strong point, I think, for the Christian position, that there is a point in time, the research from the Big Bang, much of which is done here at Princeton, indicating that there was a start to this whole physical world we see. The third thing for me has to do with what I believe is the reality of the person and resurrection of Christ. Again, in my senior year in college, I went through a time of real crisis in my faith, trying to decide, do I believe this thing, Christianity, is true? And so there's a several-month period where I wrestled with that. And this was while I was, very involved in Christian activities and going to church. At the end of that period, I realized that my belief in Christianity had to do with the fact that I really believed the resurrection was true, that the best explanation for what happened at that time, what's recorded in the Gospels, the motivation of the early church and the people who claimed to have witnessed this, was in fact this was true. And if that was true, then of course Christianity is true.
So we have points from the moral area, the reality of right and wrong. We have a point in the area of science, saying that the evidence seems to indicate there was a point in time when the universe began and then the resurrection. Dr. Biagini, it looks like a lot has been covered. Would you like to add anything?
Yes, well, from my point of view, there are two sides to the answer I would give. There's a personal side, which will start probably from Dr. Kaita's point, which I feel very personally, because it was an integral part of the way in which I became a Christian. But also from a professional point of view, as a historian, I would call this person's attention on the amazing historical professionality of much of the biblical writing. I mean, not all the Bible is, history books, but many of them are, and the way they are written in terms of the critique of facts and the balance between social history, economic factors, personal choice, political history, military history, just amazing. I mean, it's difficult to find it in contemporary history to some extent, and surely what is striking is the extent to which none of the biblical historians had any difficulty in denouncing the flaws in the personality of the heroes of their stories. People such as Moses or Abraham or David come out to the Bible as ordinary sinners in such a way as you wish to find in contemporary history on present day or 19th century characters. But despite the fact that we know in terms of documents, in terms of primary sources, quite a lot more about these 19th century or 20th century characters, I feel that much of present-day historiography falls short of biblical standards from a professional point of view. So that is a strong argument from my experience.
So the actual biblical data indicate no hero development of heroes so much as a presentation of their flaws.
Precisely. What I'm saying is that if the methodology and the reliability of these documents as professional history is apparent, so possibly this is a further argument why the spiritual content of the Bible should be listened to carefully before you make a decision.
Dr. Sprodom Kaida, what would you add about what kind of a variety of things did you encounter in this pilgrimage, in this checking out of the possibility of faith in Christ?
I consider myself very fortunate in having Christian parents, being raised in a Christian home, but a home where there was a great premium, an emphasis on education. My parents were very well educated, and I remember very vividly my father encouraging critical reading of the Bible as well as books like The Origin of Species at a fairly young age. And so there was always a sense of lively discussion of these truths embodied in the great works, the Bible and other works that people had produced over the years. And also a sense that what, as Dr. Prudhomme was mentioning, what you know about nature and the book of nature, as it were, is no different in terms of its truth, its veracity, than what you would find in the book of the laws or the scripture, that they are all part of an integrated whole, something coming from the same creator of both. And so I very vividly remember parents taking me to museums and going to collect rocks and things of that sort, and appreciating God's creation from that perspective, but also, along with the comments that Dr. Biagini was mentioning, getting a sense that when the Bible is spoken of, it was just as real. I remember my father dragging out maps of the Middle East and pointing out where these things actually occurred. And so in a sense, that history that was embodied in the scriptures, that knowledge of the universe that God had created, was all a seamless picture of a complete whole, that there was no distinction between that which was scriptural or that which was having to do with God and other worlds and the natural world that the contemporary person would have to use as the only judge of reality. But instead, they were all part of what God had created, and having gone to college in the 60s and the 70s with all the turmoil, there was a tendency of wanting to question everything, and I have to admit I had my periods of doubts and questions, as Dr. Prudhomme had mentioned. But I think through it all, I would have to say the grace of God, I think these foundations served me well in keeping my feet in the right direction, as it were, and my face in the right direction.
If the evidence, let's say that the evidence of the world, history, scientific evidence, if it's such a good fit with the claims, the truth claims of Christianity, why is it that we encounter the kind of, at times in the universities, we encounter this kind of hostile caricature of Christianity as something that's irrational? Let me mention the well-known cartoon that Dr. Provine, not Dr. Prudhomme, but Dr. Provine at Cornell University, the eminent biologist, put in a recent essay. And the cartoon showed a Gothic church door, and there by the door was a brain bin, even a box with, written on the side was, "Brains, please." So the implication is check your brains before you enter the church door. And of course, Dr. was it Dawkins, I believe, author of Blind Watchmaker, the professor at Oxford, has said that the creation concept found in the Bible is has no more value than the idea that I think he said that the idea of a West African tribe that says that the world was made from the excrement of ants. Okay, those two stories are equally mythological. How do you, number one, how do you explain this sort of barrage, in basic terms, this picturing of Christianity as irrational, and then how do you respond to those kinds of comments?
I'm not a scientist, but this week I was reading in Times Higher Education Supplement an article by John Polkinghorne, who is president of Queen's College, Cambridge, and who, before becoming a minister in the Church of England, was an eminent physicist and suppose still has a considerable reputation in the profession. And the least you can say in answer to this question is that as a scientist you should not absolutize your working hypotheses, which are still hypotheses. I mean, I'm surprised that you can be so, Professor Provine can be so confident about what he believes to have found, because whatever, both in history and in other fields, whatever we know is limited by the data we have, and those are always, and by definition, incomplete.
Any other comments?
Well, I think that there two parts to that question, Tom. You began this whole interview asking what points of contact do we have with students, and by and large, the points of contacts I have with students, faculty, staff are at a very personal level. I mean, they're my secretary who has a daughter with Down syndrome, a graduate student of mine who didn't pass her general examinations, had to leave. It's in these interactions that I share who I am and actually have most opportunity to share what our Christian faith says about living. And so in that sense, it's no different than if I were at General Electric or a National Lab or somewhere else. There's nothing unique about teaching that's different than any other vocation. Yes, there are issues on our campus that are, there's disagreement, sharp disagreement about. But I don't, that's sort of the nature of the university, and I don't think it's particularly directed against Christians. At least on the Princeton campus, I've seen my relationships with my colleagues is really based upon respect and on the ability to share who I am with them. And there are issues, as I said, of disagreement on the campus, areas of abortion or sexuality or whatever.
As it is on any campus.
Any campus and any other venue. It's not unique to the university.
Yes.
I might add that getting back to the idea of where particular caricatures have arisen, I think that in itself, in a sense, answers the question. Because these attitudes that many people have, at least in my mind, are just that. They are straw men. They are attempts, I feel, again, in my opinion, to, as it were, marginalize a particular person's faith or convictions or whatever. And then if you take that as your starting position, then you can do things which bother me as a scientist, as they bother Dr. Biagini in reading about science, where then absolute statements are made about what we know and what we don't know. The reality that we deal with as scientists, and that's why we are scientists, to try to understand more about that reality, do have these fuzzy edges, these unanswered questions. That's why we stay in business as scientists. However, these caricatures, these ideas that we create, these straw men, are very well defined, and you can attack them, and you can control them, you can marginalize them. And I think, just thinking when I've tried to deal with questions of doubt and morality and things in my mind that still go through my mind as a Christian, I have to say that whenever I have this temptation to do this kind of marginalizing myself, of characterizing various straw men myself, I tend to realize that it's not as a result of an objective analysis of what people are saying or what the reality is, but more trying to then say, I am uncomfortable with something. I have a moral question. I have something that is forcing me to do something I don't want to do. Therefore, let me create a comfortable caricature that I can attack.
Well, let me get back to the straw men that you mentioned. I appreciate you bringing that point out. I think that perhaps what Drs. Dawkins or Provine may be dealing with is a Christianity different, or a picture of Christianity that's different from what you're representing here. Since those characterizations or those straw men come from the field of science, let me throw out the question, if someone were to come to you and say, does the evidence of science, particularly Dr. Prudhomme and Dr. Caeta, does the evidence of science tend to support or be a problem for the idea that there's an intelligence behind the universe?
I think briefly it goes back to questions such as those raised by what Dr. Prudhomme was mentioning about the origin of the universe, the idea of the fact that there was a start to things as we know them, and that we can't really know about what happened before, as it were, the Big Bang. That's beyond the realm of science. At least in my discipline, I think it's fascinating and perhaps a little unnerving that there are these fundamental physical constants. There are the nature of physical laws that people have been exploring for quite a few years now, and realize that small changes in them would not make it possible for us to exist. And so these are the kinds of evidences that people do have to confront on a day-to-day level, whether it's in my area or in Dr. Prudhomme's area. You don't have to confront them because you can still do the calculations, you can still do productive things. But shall we say, in the quiet of those reflective moments that we would like to have perhaps more of, we have to ask ourselves these questions, or if we do ask ourselves these questions, you do have to confront, in my opinion, the evidence of a creator behind it, or come up with some ad hoc argument that says that maybe if we have an infinite number of universes and we just happen to be in the one where everything works out so we exist, that's fine. But I think this is why Professor Polkinghorne, whom Dr. Biagini had mentioned, is so good at calling this in a very straightforward way. These are philosophical positions. These are metaphysical positions, and they should be called them.
So you're saying then science is not a problem for an articulate, presentation or acceptance of the Christian faith. And would you would say that generally you don't find scientists having to deal with, let's say, problem areas?
Well,
okay.
it's in fact the converse. If you look at lists of Christian faculty members compiled by various organizations who have ministries with Christian faculty members across the nation, you'll find that a larger percentage of those people on those lists are in sciences and engineering than they are in the social sciences. So the data says it's not a significant problem for those of us in science or engineering. You, again, look at the data, and many of the great men of science have been, in fact, believers. Isaac Newton wrote more in theology than he wrote in science. So the data says that there is no intrinsic conflict between faith and science. Every individual has their own weighting functions, their own weight that they're going to put to various pieces of evidence. And so there are certainly people like Provine who, looking at the same data, will put a different weighting on things and come to different conclusions. So I don't think, I would never say that the evidence is so compelling that one cannot intellectually believe anything else. That I don't think is the case. But I think the evidence is certainly strong enough to say that that the lines that we talked about earlier in this talk, they all lead to the same conclusion, and it's easy for me to understand that that's the best, that's the conclusion that all of those different routes lead to.
Let's say that someone came along and hearing your comments today said, well, I'm impressed that we have a trio of very articulate, obviously very intelligent, highly trained professors at Princeton, and they say, I'm willing to consider that Jesus was a good man with wonderful moral systems and a terrific insight, but this, I'm not ready to accept him as God. I think that he was a great moral scholar or a moral teacher, let's say on the level of Confucius, but being Christianity, having the sense of claim that Christ, should receive all of our allegiance. How would you answer someone who says, well, Jesus is a great teacher, I'll admit that, but I don't want to go beyond that? How would you deal with that?
This thought isn't original with me, but if you have that argument, I've heard it said that you can't then escape the claim that he made, namely that he is the Son of God. And the salvation that we have through his death and resurrection is based on that claim. And it's very difficult to think of any other person who claimed to have been a moral teacher, a sane human being, who would then similarly make that claim. And that, for me, gives you a very strong statement of uniqueness that you have to confront.
Okay. Anyone want to camp on that or move along?
Well, very much along the lines of what Professor Keita was just saying, it seems to me that if you examine the evidence of the Gospel and the New Testament in the light of Jesus being just a moral teacher, this hypothesis doesn't make any sense, because as a moral teacher, he should have tried to extend his professions, to speak, his mission as a moral teacher for as long as possible, in the same way as Socrates did. But by claiming that he was the Son of God in a monotheistic society in which this was, a capital crime, he was undermining his own career as a moral teacher. So it seems to me that this hypothesis simply doesn't work and generates either the hypothesis that he was insane, that is, he was deliberately courting death, or that, he did not want to be a moral teacher. He was actually the Son of God.
So you would tend to come alongside and agree with the claim made by C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
That based on his
Absolutely.
claims, either he was, the alternatives is he was a liar, a charlatan, or he was, mentally unbalanced, or he was who he claimed to be. Let me go ahead and throw out the related question. Let's say someone says, well, I don't think he ever made those claims. I don't think that the New Testament is a reliable source, a reliable history. I think that these are stories that were passed down and changed over hundreds of years. Translations, often people say, how do we know what the original said because of so many, hands that it passed through? How would you reply to that? I mean, that's a question I've heard brought up on the university campus a number of times. And maybe Dr. Biagini, as a historian, you mind if I ask you that question?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Well, I'm not an expert, of course, but for one thing, we can at least check the parts of the New Testament which relate to contemporary society, to the working of, Middle East or a Roman province in the Middle East at the time. And what we find is that the details in the New Testament are actually perfectly reliable in terms of the political geography, the division between provinces, for instance, which archaeology has demonstrated to be perfectly correct. As documents, I'm referring now to Acts of Apostles. Archaeological evidence from Anatolia has shown that the division in provinces we find in Acts is actually a first century Roman organization or local government. And we can check lots of other details concerning social life, the material life, the economy of this region, or the level of interchange between ethnic groups, or the working of Roman justice, which is, the New Testament is one of the main sources, main historical sources, if you want to find out how Roman justice worked, apart from the great orations of Cicero and the other classical documents.
So some historians working here at the end of the 20th century do use the book of Acts or the Synoptic Gospels as sources to get information, reliable information?
Well,
from?
it is definitely one of the sources. Obviously, there are lots of others, as in many other fields.
Okay. Well, that is coming from someone who should know something about history, Dr. Prudhomme.
Another thing that has always impressed me is what happened to the early disciples. If Jesus never made these claims of, in fact, being the Son of God, and if he, in fact, did not come back from the dead, if the resurrection is not true, then you had these 12 disciples who went on to be martyred and gave their life for something they knew wasn't true. To me, that's a very strong argument that, in fact, what we have recorded in the Gospels is true. These men were willing to give their lives for what they heard from Christ and heard these claims that he made.
How do you integrate the data from your field into a coherent picture, given the presuppositions, given the perspective that you bring into your work of a Christian faith perspective? Do you find that a challenge, and what are some unique principles or ways that you accomplish this, integrating the big picture? Anybody? Dr. Biagini.
Okay, yes. Well, obviously, I work on 19th century British history, so the level of integration is not in terms of the topic of my research. It is in terms of, for one thing, the understanding of human nature, and on the other, the methodology of history, and in particular the example set by the historical writers in the Bible, which is go for the truth. Do not be afraid of, admitting weaknesses, flaws in church history, in church leaders, or in Christian, figures, in Christian characters in history. Just go for the truth. God is the creator of this universe. He's greater than our discoveries. He's greater than the results of our research. And this applies to history as much as to any other field of human knowledge. It is also tremendously important for me to be reminded that human beings are shaped by grace and sin. They are fallen creatures, but they have been created in the image of God. And these are the two sides of the picture you have to keep in mind when assessing human social events. Another further consideration is who are the subjects of history. And the Bible is not concerned only with kings or with, great figures. In fact, many of the characters are just ordinary men and women. This is quite extraordinary for ancient history, the role of women in biblical literature. And in many cases, they are actually the humblest men and women of those days, including, in fact, the family of Jesus, which was by present-day standard sort of artisan, working class background. And the offer, for instance, which they give for his purification is just a couple of doves, which is, according to Leviticus, the offer given by people who were not able to pay more, to offer more. So obviously the background of these people was not. And these are the people historians should be concerned with, as well as the kings and the rulers and the high politics and, the important figures, to speak, between inverted commas.
So the faceless masses, if you will. Or
Yes, which are not faceless from the point of view of God.
From
Actually,
the point of view of God.
What is terrifying is that all those who suffer in history, all of them, God is personally acquainted with them. With each of them, each of the people who have been murdered in Bosnia recently was personally known by God. He was there, he knew what was happening. That is, if you think of it, that is really terrifying. So.